You're listening to episode 69 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Laura Schmalzl joins us to speak about the neurology of movement-based contemplative practices. If you break down yoga, for example, as a contemplative practice, what do you end up with? What are those parts? How do they work together? And what does recent scientific research into a variety of movement practices indicate for clinical applications? Like most complex areas of study, we don't have all the answers, and some well-established practices are getting a new look through the lens of critical thinking. It's early in taking a more mechanistic approach, and that doesn't take away from how these movement practices move us, and may even enrich the experience. Laura Schmalzl is a clinical neuropsychologist with a PhD in cognitive science, completing postdoctoral work in cognitive neuroscience. Much of her past research has revolved around elucidating the cognitive and neural bases of various aspects of body representation. Specifically, Laura has been involved in behavioral and neuroimaging studies investigating limb proprioception in healthy individuals and amputees, and in the development of tools to alleviate phantom pain. Besides her academic work, Laura is also a dedicated yoga practitioner and certified yoga instructor, and by combining her interests is now involved in a series of scientific studies investigating the effect of yoga-based practices. She is the managing editor of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy and an associate editor of Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. Our guest today is Laura Schmalzl. Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Very glad to have you here, and we'll start by having you tell us a little bit about your background.
Okay, let me start by saying that I'm Italian, but I lived in Australia for a big chunk of my life, and then I lived in Sweden, and now I live in California. So if there's anything strange with my accent, that's why. It's a conglomeration of many different influences. From a, I guess, more academic point of view, I originally trained as a clinical neuropsychologist before then embarking on a PhD in cognitive science and postdoctoral work in cognitive neuroscience and behavioral medicine. Along the way, sort of while I was doing still my master's and beginning on my PhD, about 15 years ago, I really got into yoga. And pretty early on, it just kind of planted a seed that became just as interesting as the other studies that I was doing. And I just really always had a vision that at some point I would like to combine the two and do some kind of, science, clinical yoga related work. And, as in life, things take time. So it's taken me a few years until I could actually make it happen. But yeah, that's sort of how the two came together.
What are some of the most interesting aspects of your work?
For me personally, one of the most interesting aspects of my work, or one of the most satisfying aspects of my work, is to be able to bring yoga to populations that wouldn't otherwise try it, or otherwise practice it. And so that's not necessarily, I guess, the theoretical or scientific aspect, but from a personal level, that's really the thing that drives me a lot. So over the past years, I worked here at UC San Diego on a big project that was conducted in collaboration with the VA hospital. So we developed a yoga program for veterans. It was specifically targeted toward veterans with chronic low back pain. And as part of that, I got also to teach some of the intervention, and to be in front of a group of people that are very skeptical about the practice to start with, and see them slowly warming up to it and grow with it. Like, that was one of the most beautiful things ever, I guess. Similarly, in a less sort of dramatic fashion, I also conducted a study with UCSD college kids who were just, young, healthy adults who had never practiced yoga before, which was quite difficult to find in the San Diego area, mind you. Like, we had difficult to recruit people between the ages of 18 and 35 that had never done yoga before. It was like, that was sort of an unforeseen challenge. But once we got, a solid group together, it was then mainly, I guess, the sort of nerdy biology or engineer majors that we got on board. And again, just seeing people that didn't really believe in sort of the effects of the practice, and then just seeing them sort of develop throughout the course of the program, or of the intervention, if we want to call it like that. Like, that was one of the nicest things. And I think probably because it reflects also my path with yoga. Like, I was just not interested for many years, and I just always saw it as something that was, a little bit too out there and a little bit too quote unquote spiritual. And I wasn't really drawn to it. And if anything, I was skeptical that it would do any good. And then it kind of disconfirmed all my hypotheses once I actually tried it. So to me, seeing other people have the same experience, that's one of the things that motivates me the most in my yoga related work.
I can understand that, because having approached meditation with the same kind of healthy skepticism, not really knowing what is this, what am I getting into, and finding for myself, and seeing that there are others like yourself and other people that we know who are doing research, who are really taking a look at physiologically, neurologically, what's happening, what effects on the immune system that are measurable, tangible, material results, is just a wonderful thing. And the human experience of seeing appropriate skepticism shifting into understanding and knowledge and curiosity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful. So you and your co-author, our friend Kathy Kerr, how did you two meet? There's a story there.
There's a story there, yes. So Kathy and I met at the first Mind and Life Summer Research Institute that I attended 5 years ago now. And yeah, it's sort of become a little tradition for me. I've been back every year since then, and kind of planning to keep attending until they kick me out at some point. It's just a lovely, again, conglomeration of, people being interested in contemplative practice as well as science. And I got there at the end of my second postdoc, which I did at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. I was at the time working on different aspects of body representation. So how the brain processes information related to, both like interoceptive signals, but also sensory information. And it was already like on my trajectory to move toward, yoga research. So it wasn't like strictly yoga research, but I was using a lot of methodology and addressing questions that I thought were relevant for yoga. But I really, really wanted to do yoga research. And in Europe, there was, nobody working clearly with that. And so I decided to literally take some time off and enrolled in more yoga teacher trainings that were held here in the US. But before doing that, I attended the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute The topic of the research institute in that year was the role of the body in contemplative practices. And so that's what drew me to attend it. And I didn't really know anyone. And as I told you off microphone before, I don't consider myself really being a scholar in any way. And I always feel like I kind of landed in academia by accident. So I was a little bit intimidated at the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute with the scholars and philosophers surrounding me at the lunch tables. But I got to meet Peter Wayne, who held the Tai Chi classes there. And I just asked him, do you know anyone who I could talk to? I'd be really interested in doing yoga related research. And he said, why don't you talk to Kathy Kerr? I mean, she doesn't do yoga related research, but I think she'd be a good person for you to talk to. And so I just stalked her and, hunted her down, and I'm like, what should I do from here? And she just was very, very open, she took on a little bit of a mentorship role for me ever since then. I don't know whether she views it that way, but I anyway view her as that. So that's how we got to know each other. And she made some concrete suggestions of people that I could contact, but more than that, she just really inspired me to just go for what I'm really interested in, and to not be afraid to dream big, so to speak. It's always like one of the things that she always tells me, and that's always kind of that sticks with me, is that it doesn't take more energy or more effort to go for what you really, really want than to go for something that's like a compromise. So you might as well start there. and then, according to like realistic possibilities, you might scale it down. But I don't know, she just boosted my confidence in like not giving up in actually landing at doing yoga research at some point, even though I had already completed my second postdoc. Yeah. And so we kind of just stayed in contact, without any like practical or like concrete collaborations for a while, but we just, stayed in contact. So then when it came to launching the special issue that I guess we'll be talking about next, I touched base with her.
So what made you decide to collaborate on this special issue, and what is it?
Peers in Human Neuroscience, which some of your listeners might be familiar with, is a open access journal, which has holds these things they call research topics, which basically correspond to special issues, other journals. And I published with them a few papers before. And so I was contacted by them whether I wanted to host one of those research topics. The invitation was to host it on things that I had published with them before, which was multisensory integration. I'd done some work with amputees and phantom pain and things like that. But at the time, like I had already moved away from the lab where I was doing that work and was moving into doing yoga related work here at UCSD. And so I emailed them back and I said, yes, I'd love to do a special issue, but, I'm sort of changed directions, and my interest would be to do it on, something to do with yoga meditation. And I didn't really think they would buy into it, but to my surprise, they emailed back and they said, yeah, that would be great. And so I'm like, okay, now I need a partner in crime for this. And as always,
and who else comes to mind when you're thinking crime but Kathy Kerr?
Exactly. Who else comes to mind? So I contacted Kathy. I still remember the exact instant. I was in Miami, Florida, of all places, on a sort of yoga intensive, training. And I remember calling her from my hotel room, and so we kind of, decided there and then, that we'll embark on this together. And then we just figured out, or we're just thinking of, how would we call it, or what would the title be? Because, I'm coming from a yoga background, and Kathy does a lot of work on Tai Chi. And it obviously had to, be of interest to both of us. So there and then we came up with the, title of Movement-Based Embodied Contemplative Practices, which then got us into trouble a little bit. I can get into that as well. So that was the title of the research topic, is Neural Mechanisms Underlying Movement-Based Embodied Contemplative Practices. And so we put together a proposal, 2 frontiers, and the way that works, we just literally kind of like you write an abstract for a conference and you just say like, this is our idea. These are some prospective contributors, even though at that stage you obviously don't know who will be on board and who won't. And then, once they accept the proposal, then it gets posted on their website, and, you contact people or labs that do work in the area. And it's what I also like about it is that contributions can be original research articles, but they can also be like hypothesis and theory papers or review articles or even just perspective papers or opinion articles. So it's really a whole spectrum, which is, I guess, fitting and relevant for this specific area, because while there is some good research going on, it's really a young field where I think solid sort of theoretical proposals of how the field should move forward, I think, are really, really important. And so those are actually some of my favorite contributions in the special issue are of sort of more theoretical nature. So we launched the topic and didn't really think about the title anymore. And then a week later or something, I got an email from Marty Crane, who is at Dartmouth, and ended up being one of our contributors. And she sent me an email and she's like, this looks really interesting, but what exactly are movement-based embodied contemplative practices? And I was like, like yoga and Tai Chi. And she said, yeah, but what about Feldenkrais? And what about the Alexander technique? And what about somatic experiencing? And, what exactly do you mean by movement? And what exactly do you mean by embodiment? And so we had about, I don't know, but quite a few emails going back and forth. And at some point I just said, if we would turn these emails into a perspective article, I actually think that would be useful for us as well as for prospective contributors. So that sort of led to the introductory article of the special issue, which was actually a really good exercise for me as well. We kind of throw these words of, movement-based practices and embodied practices around quite loosely without really thinking of what we mean by them. And then, once you start thinking about it, like what qualifies as movement? I mean, there is really no such thing as no movement, because once there is no movement at all, we're dead basically, because like something in your body is moving all the time. But I guess we kind of came to the conclusion that, it had to be, the active intentional act of like to just simply sitting and watching your breath wouldn't obviously qualify as a movement-based practice. But if you do a very active breathing technique where you actively expand your rib cage and then contract it again, that would actually qualify as a movement, even though you're not jumping around. Movement. Yeah. And then when we get into embodiment, and I won't get into that because like I don't
there are papers there to talk about it.
Yeah. But also, like as long as we do whatever we do in the body that we live in right now, it can only be embodied, like what, and unless we have an experience of disembodiment. It was just a useful exercise, long story short, to really think about what these terms mean and what kind of practices would qualify for this issue. And so, so that's how it all began. And then we got lots of people to contribute to it, and just recently had our last paper accepted. And so just published the editorial recently, which is draw your attention to it.
Which is what drew our attention. And for folks who are listening, I am linking to that. So you'll find it on the episode page for this episode, that editorial. And what's interesting in there is you have in that piece that you are talking a bit more about. The articles aim to more clearly define these key concepts. What do we mean by movement, embodiment, contemplation, intention, and all of that? So I'm eager to see what comes out of the results. And it's interesting the way you described the different kinds of pieces that are in this issue, that some of it is maybe research oriented, some of it may be more opinion or hypothesis based. And that's okay, because that's where field is right now, is discussion. There isn't a long body of hard scientific work on it. It's very young in this process, the same as we see in mindfulness type studies. We're seeing the same in movement-based studies as well.
And it's particularly young when it comes to understanding the mechanisms. I guess I want to point out that, because if you just look at the, amount of literature that's out there in terms of like yoga, for example, specifically. I mean, there's been like an exponential increase over the past, years and decades. So there is a lot out there. But the great majority at this stage is really more sort of efficacy research where, with pre-post and certain symptoms of certain clinical populations improve. But studies that actually in very clear detail, look at what are the specific mechanisms that drive these effects. There, I think we're still very much in the infancy of the field. And one of the main challenges when it comes to movement-based practices is just that they have so many different ingredients, and therefore it's complicated to do well-controlled studies. I mean, it's always complicated, but I guess in this case in particular, because you have, the aspect of the movement, you have the aspect of the breath, which is in most of these practices, some way, in some or other way controlled or anyway addressed. And then you have the various attentional components. So there is lots of different, what we call bottom-up and top-down mechanisms that interact with each other. And so that makes it, difficult in its own right to isolate the components that really drive the different effects. And I think, so that's why there is still lots of work to be done.
So in reviewing the papers that you've received, are there some things that are standing out for you that you're particularly excited about?
You're asking me to pick a favorite of my children, right? No, I mean, as I said, we had some really exciting data papers. For example, a paper showing increased functional connectivity in certain brain areas in yoga practitioners compared to controls, and sort of more technical papers. But I must say my favorites are the very thorough sort of hypothesis and theory articles that sort of lay the ground for the field and that really address the issues that are important as this field grows in a critical way. And I guess what I hope is that it inspires people to, even maybe scale back a step in terms of being ambitious of the questions they want to ask, but just seeing the importance of doing the research step by step in little ways, and seeing that actually as a building the foundation in a really solid way, rather than, seeing it as just a slow progress.
I think that's a very good point about laying a solid foundation where the understanding may have been a little soft, maybe not quite as comprehensive as we would like, at least in a mechanistic sense. Once we have a little bit firmer ground, not rock solid, but maybe a little bit firmer ground in an understanding of that, what are you hoping happens next? What are you hoping occurs with movement-based contemplative practices in the coming years?
What I would like to see is in different levels, from sort of basic science perspective, just for those practices to be, I guess, taken as seriously as more traditional or seated contemplative practices, that they can be operationalized and, studied in just as a rigorous way. In terms of more an application perspective, I think an interesting thing to think about, or an important thing to think about, is what practices are beneficial for what type of people. And there is not to say that, a movement-based practice is better than a seated meditation practice or the other way around. They're just different. And so, depending, I guess where I would like the sort of science and clinical interaction to move toward is to make advances in our understanding or our ability to assess where specific practices can be applied in the most useful way. Therefore, I think one of the main things is to really understand the different components, parts in a more profound way. If you do a yoga practice that has a movement component to it versus just a breathing practice, what is the differential outcome, and which people might respond better to one practice than the other? And in an even larger scale, I guess thinking more globally, I'd love for yoga to grow and become, an integrated, complementary or integrative medicine practice that is, recognized as such on the same levels as, whether it is acupuncture or massage therapy or whatever it is. I really think that it can be a very useful and important, tool to apply to various health conditions. So,
Laura, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
So in the context of my work, I always talk about yoga-based practices and not yoga, because to me, yoga with a capital Y is a way of life. And there is no way that I want to, assume or pretend or that I'm measuring any of that big thing. And to me, there is no such thing as an 8-week yoga intervention, that just doesn't exist. And, if we practice yoga a lifelong, maybe at the very end of our life, we can say that we have some, we're no longer complete beginners, but in 8 weeks, we're not doing yoga. So just being very clear about that, what we're doing, especially in an applied clinical practice, is that we take elements that are influenced and by different styles of yoga that are to do with movement, breath, and attention, and that we use them in a way that allows us to formulate hypotheses and study them. And I don't think, that this is to do yoga justice. I wouldn't want to call the scientific work that I do yoga.
Our guest today has been Laura Schmalzl. You can find out more about Laura and her work on the link that we'll have on the website. Laura, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.